احنا مجتمعين النهارده في ضيافة شبكة العلاقات المسيحية الإسلامية علشان نتكلم عن موضوع مهم جدا يتعلق بهذه العلاقات، وهو حوار الأديان. الحقيقة إنه فكرة حوار الأديان أو مصطلح حوار الأديان هو من المصطلحات اللي بتتداول كثيرا جدا، زيها زي المواطنة، زيها زي قبول الآخر، زيها زي كثير من المصطلحات اللي هي احنا ساعات بنكون عارفين المشكلة فين والحلول ايه، بس ما عندناش خريطة طريق، ما عندناش خطوات معينة على أرض الواقع تخلينا نحس بنوع من التغيير رغم وجود متخصصين ورغم يعني وجود كتير من النظريات وكتير من الأمور اللي مفترض ان هي تساعد على تقدم هذا الملف. وبالتالي وجودنا النهارده او وجود مجموعه من المتخصصين زي حضراتكم للحديث في موضوع زي ده هو امر مهم جدا. انا رصدت قبل كده في الكتاب المقدس 77 موضع بيستخدم مصطلح بعضكم بعضا بمشتقاته، بعضكم بعضا، بعضكم لاجل بعض، بعضكم لبعض. وبالتالي الكتاب بيؤكد جدا على فكره ان الانسان مش مقتطع من سياق، الإنسان مش ملقى في الفراغ، الإنسان إنسان عايش في جماعة. القرآن الكريم كمان بيؤكد نفس موضوع الجماعات والوجود في جماعات، زي الآية الشهيرة جعلناكم شعوبا وقبائل لتعرفوا. ففكرة إنه إحنا أفراد في جماعة، هذا يستلزم بالضرورة فكرة الحوار اللي إحنا بنتكلم عليه النهاردة. حوار طبعا هادئ، حوار بعيدا عن الملاسنات، حوار بعيدا عن المشاحنات والترندات وكل آفات الحوار، من فكرة جادلهم بالتي هي أحسن وفكرة أعرض عن الجاهلين وغيرها. ورأيي أنا البسيط يعني إنه الهدف الأساسي من حوار الأديان أو أي حوار عموما هو فكرة الوصول للسلام النفسي، يعني فكرة إن الإنسان يبقى عنده سلام نفسي، فائض هذا السلام لاحقا يعمل ما يعرف بالسلام المجتمعي. فأنا بظن إنه يعني حجر الزاوية أو واسطة العقد أو عمود الخيمة في أي حوار، الهدف من أي حوار هو فكرة الوصول للسلام النفسي علشان يبقى فيه بعد كده سلام مجتمعي. لأنه ما نقدرش طبعا نوصل للسلام المجتمعي بدون السلام النفسي، على طريقة يعني إن كان النور الذي فيك ظلاما فالظلام كم يكون. الموضوع مهم، محتاجين يعني ناس استثنائيين يتكلموا عنه. علشان كده بدعو حضراتكم للترحيب معايا بضيفنا النهارده الدكتور مايكل نزير-علي. انا هرحب بيه لان انا بحبه قوي. الله يسلمك. طبعا جرى العرف في مثل هذه الاجتماعات ان احنا بنقول تعريف بالضيف. ضيفنا النهارده غني عن التعريف، لكن انا بستأذنك اني هقرأ جزء صغير من سيرتك الذاتيه الكبيره. يعني الدكتور مايكل نزير-علي لمده 15 عاما كان الاسقف رقم 106 لمدينه روتشستر. هو من اصل جنوب غرب اسيا، اول اسقف ابرشي في كنيسه انجلترا من المولودين بالخارج. ايضا طبعا السيره كبيره جدا فانا بنتقي سطور. يعني شغل دكتور مايكل قبل ذلك منصب الامين العام لجمعيه الارساليات الكنسيه. من الامور المهمه ايضا انه يعني يحمل الجنسيتين الانجليزيه والباكستانيه، وهو عضو في مجلس اللوردات البريطاني منذ سنه 99. هو الآن رئيس مركز أوكسفورد للتدريب والبحث والدعوة والحوار. يعني آسف على الإطالة، وبنترك المجال لدكتور مايكل يقول كلمته. وتفضل يا فندم.
سيدات وسادات، إني أشكركم جزيلاً لدعوتكم لهذا المؤتمر، وأنا أصلي لنجاح المؤتمر إن شاء الرب. وفي اللغة الفارسي سيدة شائمة بانوان وآقيان، وفي اللغة الأردو معزز خواتين وحضرات. Muslims and Christians have been living with one another, working together and debating with one another from the very beginning. Professor Gabriel Said Reynolds has recently shown in his book Christianity and the Quran the significant presence of Christians in the Hijaz, not just around Arabia, but in Arabia itself, and the extent of the Quranic interaction with Christian figures, beliefs, and practices. We learn from the Seerah that the Prophet of Islam had close relations with Christians such as Waraqa bin Nawfal, cousin of the Prophet's wife Khadija, and Ubaidullah bin Jahash, and that there was dialogue with them regarding his mission. Accounts of his encounters with Christian monks, variously named in the tradition as Bahira and Nastur, indicate a sympathetic view of them. As you know, the Quran also praises them for their humility. La yastakbiruna, that they did not have takabbur, while being critical of those who had forgotten their original vocation and succumbed to pride and greed, as for example in Surat At-Tawbah. How can we forget that the first hijrah, we've already been reminded about this, was to the Christian kingdom of Abyssinia or Ethiopia, where the Muslim Muhajirun were welcomed by the Negus or emperor on the basis of a theological dialogue concerning the person of Jesus and his mother. That is what the dialogue was about, and I think we've been reminded of that this morning already. Some of these refugees returned when the Muslims moved to Yathrib, apparently already called Medina by its Jewish inhabitants, and which came to be called Madinatun Nabi, the Prophet's city, while others remained in Ethiopia. I am conscious that there are some people from Ethiopia here, and I have met a group of Muslims in that country known as the Habash, claiming descent from the original refugees and who hold that jihad is never permissible against Ethiopia because of its hospitality to the refugees. Once again, the Sahifat al-Medina has been mentioned. This is a landmark document which, according to the Seerah, regulated relations between Muslims and Jews of that city on the basis of equality and mutuality. But there were Christians and pagans present there, and the document has wider implications regarding the status of other religious groups within a Muslim majority polity. Although in its original context, its provisions did not bear the test of history, those scholars and statesmen who appealed to it as a model for plural societies in the Islamic world today seem to me to be correct in doing so. The visit of the Christians of Najran is significant also in that they were accommodated in the Prophet of Islam's mosque and allowed to perform the divine liturgy there. It is interesting in this context that the word that is used in the Seerah, Ibn Ishaq Seerah, is the word salat. They were allowed to perform the salat there. Once again, as with the immigrants to Ethiopia, there was theological dialogue, which did not result in complete theological agreement, but the visit was sufficient for the concluding of a treaty between the Muslims and Christians before the Christians returned home, accompanied by a representative of the Prophet of Islam named Abu Ubaidah in the Seerah. This event shows that dialogue is important, even if the two sides agree to disagree in peace and friendship. Dr. Andrew Morrow, also known as Ilyas Abdul Alim, has published the various letters or covenants, Qutub al-Ahad or Qutub al-Aman, of the Prophet of Islam to different Christian communities. For example, the monastery of St. Catherine in Sinai, the Christians of Persia, the Assyrians, etc. It is, of course, for the Muslims to judge their historical status. What whatever conclusion they come to, these detailed letters certainly represent a Muslim approach to Christians which is marked by generosity and friendship. Dr. Morrow's Covenant Initiative seeks to perpetuate these attitudes found in the Prophet's letters in our own times and represents an area for further research in Muslim-Christian relations. Maybe one of the centers can engage in that research. Is this initiative well known? Does it deserve to be better known? And are people still signing up to it? I'm sure that we will hear that since the 8th century AD, Christians and Muslims have been in dialogue and debate on important theological issues. The names of St. John of Damascus, who was a prominent official in the court of the Umayyad Caliph, but left to become a monk in Jerusalem, Bishop Theodore Abu Qura, Bishop of Haran, and the Assyrian Patriarch Timothy of Baghdad, who held respectful discussions with the Caliph al-Mahdi, come to mind. On the Muslim side, we have distinguished interlocutors like Al-Qasim al-Rasi, At-Tabari, and Abu Isa al-Warraq. The subjects of their discussions are wide-ranging, covering the nature of God Himself, divine revelation, prophecy, and the sending by God of the prophets and His coming to believers. What Professor Kenneth Craig, my old teacher, called the whole idea of Rasuliyah, which is common to both Christians and Muslims. What is remarkable and of relevance today is that they were able to discuss and debate with courtesy and relative freedom. Today also we need a common commitment to freedom of thought, belief, and speech, which is respectful of the other, but also clear about its own commitments. Such exchanges as the ones that I've just mentioned were not limited to theological concerns. In spite of the restrictions of the Dhimma, there also arose a great civilizational and philosophical dialogue. With the advent of the Abbasid Caliphate began the great work of translating Hellenistic, scientific, medical, philosophical, and literary learning either directly from the Greek or from Syriac, a language largely used by Christians. The translation school of Abu Yusuf Yaqub al-Kindi, the Arab philosopher he's called because so many of the philosophers writing in Arabic were actually Persians, but he was not. He was actually Arab. He's called Philasuf al-Arab, died about 870 AD. The translation school that he created was responsible for the translation by the Christian Ibn Abdullah al-Naima of the so-called theology of Aristotle, Kitab Uthologia Aristotelis, which was in reality a Neoplatonic work. It was Porphyry's paraphrase and commentary on Plotinus's Enneads. Its impact on both philosophy and mysticism in the Islamic world is difficult to overstate. I think Dr. Waghi has some flyers of a book of mine coming out on this topic, including the influence of the theology of Aristotle on tasawwuf, on Sufism. Nor is this matter merely of importance regarding the remote past. A doctoral student of mine has recently shown the influence of Platonic thinking as exemplified by Al-Farabi's Al-Madina Al-Fadila on the political vision of Ayatollah Khomeini in the concept of Wilayat al-Faqih, given flesh in the theocratic system in force in today's Iran. The father and son team of Hunayn bin Ishaq and Ishaq bin Hunayn are said to have translated between them the whole of the Alexandrian medical corpus. The father was fluent in Greek and translated from Greek into Syriac. The son perhaps better at Arabic and translated into that language from Syriac. Numerous other examples of Christian translators can be given. The Muslim rulers were often the patrons of these endeavors, and the Muslim commentators on Aristotle and what passed for Aristotle, including the theology of Aristotle, these were translated into Latin and widely read in the West. It is not an exaggeration to say that the agreement or disagreement with them and their followers shaped Western philosophical and theological thought in the later Middle Ages. When St. Thomas Aquinas, for example, refers to the philosopher, he means Averroes, Ibn Rushd. At the same time, criticism of them in the West has salient correspondences with criticism of these philosophers in the Muslim world. For example, on the question of creation, the immortality of the human person, bodily resurrection, and the status of revelation. So when Averroism was condemned by the Bishop of Paris, I think in 1277, the condemnation bears remarkable resemblances to the criticism of the philosophers in Al-Ghazali's Tahafut al-Falasifa. The same issues are raised. While the classical Sufis were undoubtedly inspired by the mystical sense of the Quran, their interest in Jesus and Christian monasticism as a way of life can also be recognized by leading Muslim scholars of the stature of Allama Iqbal and more recently Tarif Khalidi in his book, The Muslim Jesus. Sufi literature is replete with examples of such interest, as was shown by Bishop Hassan Daqani Tafti of Iran in his 3-volume book on Christ and Christianity in Persian literature. Dialogue between Christians and Sufis on the interior life is therefore of the utmost importance in fostering a better understanding of the sources of our spiritual life. Coming to more recent times, the Ottoman reforms of the Tanzimat, and in particular the Firman-e-Khat Sharif of Gulkhani, 1839, and the Khat Sharif of Humayun, 1856, at first modified and then abolished the Dhimma as expressed in the Millat system. Christians and other communities found themselves equal citizens with their Muslim neighbors. I mean, that question of a common citizenship has been mentioned again and again this morning. This led to their greatly increased participation in Ottoman and regional political, social, and educational life. In particular, they contributed significantly to the Nahda, the revival of a consciousness of Arab identity and the valuing of its linguistic, literary, and cultural aspects. In this connection, it may be worth observing that this could go equally well with a continuing loyalty to a reformed Ottomanism as to Arab nationalism. In the political sphere, we can only mention giants such as Antoun Farha, Constantine Zurek, and of course Michel Aflaq. The tireless work of Butrus al-Bustani in the revival of the Arabic language and literature, as shown in his publication of the dictionary Muhit al-Muhit and the encyclopedia Dairat al-Ma'arif. This needs no reminder, of course, in an audience like this. It is worth noting, though, that his wife Rahil was known as al-Nahda, the mother of the Nahda. Egypt owes a debt of gratitude to the Takla brothers for the founding of Al-Ahram. And Kenneth Cragg reminds us of the role that Christian schools played in the renewal of the Arabic language. After the Second World War, Christians and Muslims played a key part in the drafting of and discussions on the UN Declaration on Human Rights. The role of the Lebanese foreign minister and theologian Charles Malik in the drafting and defending of the declaration is well known. The Pakistani delegate to the United Nations, Sir Zafarullah Khan, also played a key role in persuading Muslims and Muslim states that the articles of the declaration were not contrary to the teachings of Islam. It is interesting to note that two Christians played a leading part in the development of constitutional law in emerging Islamic countries. Professor Sir Norman Anderson of London University was an expert in the mechanisms of adaptation already found in the various schools of fiqh. He particularly referred to the possibility of what he called talfiq, of patching various elements from different parts, different traditions of fiqh into something coherent for national and perhaps wider use than that. He used this knowledge to advise a range of governments in the modernization of law in their countries. Chief Justice A.R. Cornelius was head of the Supreme Court in Pakistan when the young nation was struggling to understand its Islamic inheritance and relate it to contemporary questions. As a devout Catholic, he fully understood that the development of law in Pakistan would have to take account of the principles, the maqasid of Sharia, and apply these maqasid to modern conditions. So the hifz ad-din, al-nafs, al-nasl, al-aql, al-mal, and so forth. These are the so-called maqasid of Sharia. He was a student of developments in this respect in Turkey, as found, for example, in the Majalle. The principles of Islamic law and customs which he talked and wrote about the most were ikhlas, that's been mentioned already, adl, and rahm. It is noteworthy that many of his constitutional proposals won acceptance across the political spectrum, including of the Islamist parties. In light of the above, the appointment of Bulos Iskandar Fahmi as president of the Supreme Constitutional Court in Egypt is also to be welcomed. Again, let us pray that this will lead to a greater recognition of the common citizenship of Muslims and Christians in Egypt. Where positive developments are concerned, the efforts by the Nahadat al-Ulama al-Islam in Indonesia to enable all religions to contribute to civil discourse in that country's system of Pancasila, or the 5 principles of nationhood, are worthy of mention. Scholars like Nur Khulish Majid have opened up a discourse that cannot now be cancelled or reversed. Southeast Asia is clearly an area which will become more important in terms of Muslim-Christian relations, as both Muslims and Christians seek to contextualize their faith in the cultures of that region. These positive aspects of our relationship should be affirmed and celebrated. But with sorrow, we must also recognize the negative aspects and make up our minds to remove them where they still exist or are being reinforced even today. It is true, for example, that the Dhimma allowed Christians, Jews, and others to continue living in lands under Muslim rule, but its conditions restricted their freedoms of expression, worship, and civic involvement. The continuing conflict with Byzantium weakened both sides and caused much suffering for ordinary people. Whatever the reasons for the Crusades, there was much bloodshed and despoiling of civilization. Eastern Christians suffered a great deal since the Crusaders regarded them as heretics or schismatics, and Muslims viewed them with suspicion as actual or possible allies of the Crusaders. So they were caught on both sides in a pincer movement. Today also, Muslims continue to suffer for their faith in countries like Myanmar and India, while Christians are exposed to the widespread abuse of blasphemy laws in Pakistan and to severe restrictions on freedom of expression and worship in Iran. In such situations, we must be committed to supporting one another on the basis of Article 18 of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which guarantees freedom of thought, expression, and belief. Looking then to the future, the Mustaqbil was mentioned so many times in the opening session. What could be fruitful areas of dialogue and engagement? The Ottoman reforms and the Nahda have shown us the way of shared citizenship, where there are equal rights and responsibilities and where all can play a part in nation building and in community development. The Egyptian constitution, by safeguarding certain fundamental freedoms, is also an example that can be used and further developed. Visible inclusion in national and community life, parliamentary, judicial, civil service, the armed forces, and other institutions is most important. Above all, continuing dialogue on the basis of our common heritage is crucial if misunderstanding is to be removed and difficulties addressed. I believe the centers represented here and the network itself have a vital role to play in furthering this inclusive and transforming vision. I look forward to the contributions to be made in this regard during this conference. Thank you very much indeed for your attention.
شكرا لحضراتكم، شكرا دكتور مايكل. يعني استمعنا واستمتعنا بكلمة دكتور مايكل اللي مش بس أخدتنا في رحلة عبر تاريخ العلاقات المسيحية الإسلامية، هو كمان حطينا قدام سؤال مهم جدا: إزاي الماضي ما يكونش يعني سد منيع قصاد تطور المستقبل، أو ما يكونش عبارة عن مشكلة في الحاضر. وأظن أن القيمة الأساسية للكلمة أن هي بترفض نوعين من الذاكرة الرومانسية التي لا ترى إلا لحظات الوئام والانسجام واللحظات الجميلة والجيدة، وكمان الذاكرة اللي ممكن نسميها الذاكرة الجريحة التي لا ترى إلا لحظات الصراع ولحظات الاقتتال والتشاؤم. عندي نقطة قبل ما نفتح المجال للمداخلات والأسئلة. أنا بعتقد إنه، أو أنا ممن يعتقدون إنه الأديان كلها ما كانتش رمادية أو ما كانتش غير محددة فيما يخص العالم الآخر. الأديان لها تصورات محددة جدا عن الخلاص. يعني في المسيحية ليس بأحد غيره الخلاص، وبيحط كمان الشروط الطقسية: من آمن واعتمد فقد خلص. في الإسلام إن الدين عند الله الإسلام، ومن يتبع غير الإسلام دينا فلن يقبل منه وهو في الآخرة من الخاسرين. وبالتالي أنا أو أي حد في حضراتكم أعتقد ما عندوش إجابة عن سؤال الموت، لا يوجد، لكن لازم يكون عندنا إجابة عن سؤال الحياة. سؤال الحياة لا يمكن الإجابة عنه إلا بالحوار. فإذا كان الأعداء بيقعدوا مع بعض عشان يصلوا إلى يعني اتفاقية سلام أو حاجة زي كده، فكان بالحقيقة يعني إنه أعضاء الجماعة الإنسانية الواحدة باختلاف مذاهبهم واختلاف أشكالهم يقعدوا مع بعض للوصول إلى فكرة السلام. والحوار لابد أن يكون على أرضية من التواضع، مش أرضية من نكران العقيدة. محدش بيطلب من حد ينكر عقيدته، ولكن إذا بدأت جماعة تقول إحنا شعب الله المختار لن نتحاور، لن تجد الجماعة الأخرى أي بد من إن هي تقول وإحنا خير أمة أخرجت للناس ولن نتحاور. إذن فالأصل في الموضوع إن الاختلاف يتحول يعني من خوف لمعرفة، يتحول من توتر لثقة، يتحول من ادعاء امتلاك الحقيقة إلى فكرة قبول الآخر والاتضاع وفكرة التواضع أمام الله وأمام الناس. طبعا أنا بشكر دكتور مايكل على الكلمة اللي أنا اتعلمت منها كتير جدا جدا، وهستأذنه إن أنا أبقى أخد نسخة منها. ودلوقتي بفتح لحضراتكم المجال للأسئلة أو المداخلات. هنا يعني المنصة تحت أمر حضراتكم، اللي محتاج يتداخل بس يرفع ايديه. اتفضل يا فندم.
Well, thank you very much. I'm so happy that we are here together. I just knew by chance of this great meeting from Pastor James and Imam Ashraf by chance. So I'm so glad that I could join you. And I just need to, two things came into my mind. My father, peace be upon him, God bless his soul, who passed away a quarter of a century ago, had written a book in the early 1960s, which the title was Islam, a Progressive Faith for a Dynamic World. And before he passed away, just 1 year before he passed away, in the year 2001, he updated the book and he submitted it to the Supreme Council of Islamic Research in Egypt. But unfortunately, he passed away and I never got to take it in hand. So I agree with you totally that we are progressing, humanity is progressing, and there are basics that are not changeable, and it's common to us all. And we need to follow the progression, of humanity. The other thing which I learned from my mother, God bless her soul, her name was Mrs. Anayat al-Hakim, her vision was that if you have a roundabout and many roads leading to that roundabout, if you stand at the beginning of the road, you will never realize that all roads connect and lead to that roundabout. But if you move deep enough until the roundabout, then you can see the connections. So her idea was that if you go deep enough into your faith tradition, you will realize the commonalities and our shared humanity. So these are the two thoughts that came onto our mind now, and I think which will help us progress on this great mission to bring humanity together and bridge build and face the challenge, the terrible challenges and threats that are, threatening our survival on this earth. Thank you very much.
Well, of course, this is the purpose of dialogue. What I would say is that each tradition has to discover the resources within itself that make for peace and common citizenship and reconciliation. And if Muslims are saying, as you were saying, madam, that these resources exist within Islam, that's excellent, because that is how things will develop. The same can be said for Christianity and Judaism and any other religion. These resources do not mean that there are no differences. As I was trying to say, that even in the Prophet of Islam's own lifetime, there are at least 2 instances, perhaps many more, where differences were acknowledged, but also reconciliation was possible and living together was possible. Of course, there is something in the human heart. This is where tasawwuf is so important, which aspires to a greater knowledge of God and a coming together. And we must respect that aspiration in every human heart. And again, dialogue cannot just be about common citizenship and living together, but also about discovering what the spiritual aspirations are. And this is, I think, where dialogue with Sufism is so important from the Christian point of view. Maybe the Sufis, I don't know if there are people here who have experience. So I think there is at least Dr. Ammar has some experience of the Turuq, the Sufi Turuq in Jordan, and he may care to comment on this.
طيب احنا الاسباب تتعلق بان الجلسه الاولى طولت شويه، ما عنديش الكثير من الوقت يعني، فهاخد من حضراتكم سؤال واحد، اتمنى بس من السائل انه يكون مختصر او مختصر. اتفضل.
Thank you, Dr. Michael, for this very good historical survey for Muslim-Christian relations. My question is, how, you know, the dominant hand for the Muslim-Christian studies in the academia nowadays framed by secularism, and how we as a network, faith-based network, how we can reconcile between being faith-based centers and doing serious Muslim-Christian studies. Do you see a kind of paradox in this sentence itself, or do you see any kind of way to go forward to reconcile between these two things? Thank you.
Yes, this is a very important question for academic life in the universities, particularly in the West. So what has happened is that the phenomenological approach has taken over, and what this means is that religious and moral systems can be described but not owned. You see, described but not owned. Alistair McIntyre has something to say about this in his book After Virtue. Now, there is some value in this. I'm not dismissing phenomenology, Religionsgeschichte, but it's not enough. So there are two things that academia needs to recognize. One is, as you were, I think, hinting, about personal commitment. So when I'm supervising my students who are writing doctoral dissertations, I say to them, declare your standpoint. You know, nobody is neutral. Say where you are coming from. The second thing, which is, I think, perhaps more important, is the question of interaction between people of different faiths, and indeed of the faiths themselves. This is frowned upon in academia. You know, you must describe tasawwuf in its own integrity, Christianity in its own integrity, etc. But actually, this is not how we live. We live by interaction. With tasawwuf, for instance, there is a long history of Christian interaction with tasawwuf. And to say that you can understand Christianity or tasawwuf without acknowledging this interaction is foolishness. So I think we must continue to say this to academia in the West, these two things, for them to recognize that while their phenomenological approach is all right, there are also other approaches that are valuable and necessary if the study of religion in academia is to be advanced.
يعني في الختام بنشكر حضراتكم، واعتقد انه جزء اساسي من الرساله اللي بتوجهها هذه الجلسه وهذا المؤتمر بشكل عام انه دائره الالوان ممتلئه بالالوان، وفكره ان جماعه ما او شخص ما يكون حابب انه لون واحد هو اللي يسود بس وانه باقي الالوان تختفي، ده امر غير منطقي. في 16 درجه للون الرمادي ما بين الابيض والاسود، التنوع هو الاساسي، الاختلاف لا يمكن ان يصيب المجتمع الا بطاقه ايجابيه اذا تحول هذا الاختلاف الى احترام والى ارضيه مشتركه، وزي ما قلت في المداخله السابقه ان ما يكونش في نوع من انواع الاقصاء من اي طرف لطرف اخر. يعني انا بشكر دكتور مايكل على كلماته المهمه واجاباته المهمه، ويعني سعدنا بلقائكم ونرجو ان نكون قد اسعدناكم على وعد باللقاء في الحلقه القادمه. شكرا لحضراتكم.